Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. As you can see on the slide, the topic of my talk is Arctic geopolitics before and after Ukraine, and you can ask the question, what's Ukraine got to do with Arctic politics? But I hope that will become clear during my talk. I will try to keep it relatively short and relatively general, so that there will be more time for you to be able to ask questions concerning your particular interest in the Q&A that will follow. If I the following, there we go. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Arctic is imagined, how the political imagination of the Arctic plays a relatively significant importance for how publics and politicians, and also relatively knowledgeable actually decision makers, discuss and talk about Arctic geopolitics. That will then lead me to my two main chunks, the two main chunks of my presentation: Arctic geopolitics before Ukraine, and then Arctic geopolitics after Ukraine. So you can probably hear that my talk will be focused on what has changed as a consequence of the general changes in the relationship between what we can call the West on one hand and Russia on the other hand in the Arctic. That leads me to my fourth point, the conclusions, or in other words, what for the future. But beginning with how we see the Arctic, or how the Arctic is traditionally seen, not in the region, but perhaps most or more by the people who take decisions on behalf of Arctic geopolitics. I think it's very important to note that for a very long time the Arctic is sort of an imagined region. It's a frontier region. It's a region in constant development. It's a region that is not quite there yet. In a sense, this imagination about that the Arctic will become something that it's not yet, that is not completely into its own yet, is something that has been with us for many years, right? There has been a constant discussion about the future potential for resource extraction. There has and is at the moment a discussion about the potentiality in transport, in shipping. And there's a constant political imagination that says that this will come about in a very short time. The ice will melt, all the resources will be ready for extraction. The ice will melt, everybody can sail everywhere. So there's an idea about, in general, about development. You could perhaps even say about civilization, that the Arctic is in a process of being civilized, that it's a process of being discovered, that it's in a process of being managed. And the four pictures, I think, in general show historically how this imagination of the Arctic has taken place. It's a place that you can sail in your ships and try to discover. It's a place you can go and try to colonize or Christianize the population. It's a place, as the lower left corner shows, it's a place for scientific exploration, and as the lower right-hand corner shows, it's an old picture of the pier of the Royal Danish North Atlantic Company. You can also, if you're lucky, make some money out of it. The same, however, it's also true about the potential for confrontation, the potential for geopolitical confrontation in the area. There has for a long time been this idea that the Arctic is a region ripe for conflict. Traditionally, in the Arctic, we have seen for the last years the existence of disputed territory and perhaps even also contested sovereignty, in combination with the existence of natural resources and vicinity of great powers in the region. Sort of in a traditional international relations history, these three things together makes a great cocktail for competition, confrontation, and perhaps even conflict. And therefore, it is by both commentators and analysts been commonplace to imagine the geopolitics of the Arctic as a future that could be labeled as, I quote, an Arctic gold rush, as an Arctic great game, or as an Arctic meltdown, where that could result in a new Arctic Cold War, or as the title of one of the reports on the readings list for you is, that could result in a new Iron Curtain or an ice curtain in the Arctic. And again, to relate it to the picture, this sort of popular imagination has been fueled in no small part by the 2006 flag planting event by the Russian polar scientist Arthur Chilinganov, that sort of was seen as evidence of this great game for territory, for resources going on in the Arctic. Point is, however, that the reality of Arctic geopolitics have been very different. And now I'm into point number 2, Arctic geopolitics before Ukraine. From 2006, the year of the flag planting, I think a lot of Arctic politicians gazed into the future and reacted to this imagination of an Arctic filled with conflict and tried to remedy that situation. So we've actually seen cooperation more than confrontation, and diplomacy more than military issues as the centerpiece of Arctic international politics. And these, I think, to a very large extent, excuse me, is actually the result of conscious political will to create an Arctic different from the popular imaginations. And I'll just shortly mention three examples. I think rather importantly is the Ludus Declaration signed in Greenland by the 5 coastal states, where they state that they agree upon 2 things. First of all, that they are the primary actors. So the Arctic is not a global commons that should be regulated the same way as Antarctica is regulated. No. This is an area where there are actual nation states taking the responsibility, taking upon themselves the responsibility, therefore also to regulate and act in a responsible manner. And as a side effect of that, also keeping other actors away. And secondly, underline the importance of international law in how to regulate the region, but also how to distribute the territory of the region, not least the sea floor under the Arctic Ocean. Second example is the general strengthening of the Arctic Council. In the Arctic Council, we have in the same period seen the first binding agreements between the Arctic 8. We have seen efforts making it into an actual, real international organization. It was only in 2012, I think, that the Arctic Council actually got a secretariat. Before that, it was just the responsibility of the chairmanship to sort of do the day-to-day business of the organization. Simultaneously, you can also see that the political representation going to Arctic Council meetings has risen in the seniority of the participant. Now it is often foreign ministers who participate. And the Arctic Council, therefore, today more than before, hold the potential to become sort of a cornerstone in regional regulation, and it has become an institutionalized diplomatic forum. And with that I mean that it is a forum with sort of regulated rules for how the states interact with each other, how they should interact, but also what issues are important. And I think, on a side note, that sort of debating about the Arctic in terms of sustainability, resilience, and making it a matter of safety and security and issues like that, the Arctic Council has been a key player in that. But that's a side note. And just to use the picture again, if you look at at the politicians gathered at this picture, which is from the meeting in Kiruna in 2013, I think, you can also see that they all give the impression that the atmosphere is not one of high tension. Kerry has not just loosened, but actually lost his tie, and Carl Bildt, the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, seems to be so much at home that he can put on a pullover instead of the normal sort of diplomatic attire with a tie. So that sort of gives an impression of how things actually worked very differently from the sort of traditional dystopian imagination. A third example, or a bundle of examples about pragmatic bilateral cooperation as well in the Arctic, maybe unknown to people not from Denmark or Canada. The picture is a picture of Hans Island, a very small island situated just in the middle of the strait separating Canada from the west coast of Greenland. Canada and Denmark has had a long process trying to delimitate the control of the sea, and has succeeded in that. We're still debating who actually owns the island, but it's a relatively low-key issue. More importantly, perhaps, is the delimitation of the Barents Sea between Norway and Russia in 2010. After 40 years of negotiating, in 2010, the two countries decided on how to delimit that seabed, and in general, nations to a very large extent agreed to disagree. So in sum, before Ukraine, we saw pragmatism and cooperation. Why is that the case? My argument is that it's because economy is the primary interest of all Arctic state actors. So therefore, consequently, and contrary to much popular geopolitical imagination, the inherent regional conflict potential in the Arctic is relatively low. Conflict and confrontation is bad for business. There isn't really that many sort of inherent issues that can drive conflict in the Arctic. And therefore, the key issue is, quote, spill-in of extra regional security issues into the Arctic. That at least has been my analysis, that if something were to go wrong in the Arctic, it would be stuff happening outside of the region. And I think in many ways the Ukraine crisis, at least potentially, can be a case in point of this particular dynamic of something outside of the Arctic region contaminating the otherwise relatively peaceful political relations in the region. Leading to my third point. So what has happened to Arctic geopolitics after the Ukraine crisis? On one side, there's a case for increased Arctic conflict. On the one hand, there's a radically reduced trust, especially from the Western states towards Russia. Land grab in Ukraine, why not a land grab in Arctic? Relatively straightforward case to be made, but also I think in a sense a reduced trust in the power of international law as such in the Arctic. Can the international legal system and the agreements that the states have made in the Arctic, can it bind state interests? From this reduced trust, because this is also a thing that exists in Russia, we can return to that perhaps in the Q&A. Of course, from that follows that military activity has a new significance. One of the pictures here is of a Russian military exercise landing a significant number of paratroops on the Arctic ice. That has been a continuous Russian practice. But after Ukraine and after little green men in Crimea, this exercise gets a whole new significance politically. So investments, exercises, and reorganizations of military force have a new meaning now after Ukraine. The sanctions regime, some of the Western sanctions on Russia as consequence of events in Ukraine directly target Russian economic interests in the Arctic. And of course, that may lead to a change in Russian politics. Additionally to that, we see what I have called sort of provocative diplomatic or symbolic acts that can lead to a more reduced trust than otherwise. And the other picture is an example of that. That is an expedition by Russian politician Dmitry Rogozin to the North Pole, and taking with him on his plane to the North Pole representatives from the Russian Orthodox Church blessing the North Pole, and therefore also giving it sort of a symbolic tie with Russia and with the Russian state and Russian authorities. So that means that Arctic politics now take place in a setting, in a new setting, in a new context that is increasingly marked by distrust and uncertainty. And that, of course, holds the potential for an arms race, for misperceiving other actors' intentions because of the lack of trust, and therefore also for potentially unwarranted or unwanted escalations in a military confrontation. To put it shortly, there is a risk for what international relations scholars call a security dilemma, that two or more actors in a situation both see reduced security, therefore they reinforce their military presence, but that only leaves the other actor more vulnerable, leading to an increase in his military presence, leading to an arms race, leaving both actors actually less secure than before. But on the other hand, one can also make the case against Arctic conflict as a consequence of the crisis in Ukraine. There have been, from both sort of sides, active attempts at isolating the Arctic from the generally reduced or the generally worsened relationship between the West and Russia. There were only slight incidents, or slight attempts, or slight events in the very beginning after the Ukraine crisis by Canada of trying to link Arctic diplomacy with general diplomacy, but that quieted down relatively quickly. We have seen, to a very large extent, business as usual in the Arctic Council. All parties are still able to cooperate there. And another example is that there was no mentioning at all of the Arctic or Arctic security at the 2016 NATO summit, which of course would have provoked the Russians. They were not provoked because it was not discussed. All three are examples of attempts at isolating the Arctic from the general worsened relationship. Russian diplomatic practice, as far as my diplomatic sources tell me, has been very pragmatic when it comes to Arctic affairs. That goes both with the multilateral diplomacy taking place, for instance, again in the Arctic Council, but it has also been the case in relation to the bilateral relations, for instance, the process going on at the moment, or going on last year and the year before, with both Russia and Denmark handing in claims to the UNCLOS and making claims for the seabed in the North Pole. Russia has very much played that according to the diplomatic playbook. So, what is it then? Conflict or not conflict? Will the cooperative order prevail? My sort of guess, or my hunch, or my analysis is yes, it probably will, still, because of the fact that all the countries have a key interest in stability, because that is a precondition for economic development. Economic development is key for all of the countries, but perhaps especially so for Russia, where development of the Arctic and the Arctic, or the resources in Russian Arctic, are seen as a key pillar for the future economic development of Russia as such. But there are two things perhaps that worry me, or that could lead to increased conflict. One is a shift in Russian policy, that Russian political decision makers decide that being pragmatic in the Arctic is actually not worth the effort. We can perhaps find different ways of realizing our economic interests, or we could change our economic priorities, therefore also changing the importance of Arctic economic development. Another issue that worries me is as the conflict or the reduced relationship or the worsened relationship between Russia and the West in Europe gets more solidified, and we see it becoming more and more important and more institutionalized in how European security works at the moment, and we see increased interests from also American defense establishment in the North Atlantic as such. That potentially puts more pressure on important Russian nuclear bases in the Arctic. So there is a thing that might cause concern in the Arctic is that the general Western Russian confrontation becomes more than it is at the moment about nuclear deterrence and about nuclear strategy, which will inevitably move it towards major Russian nuclear bases that are unfortunately placed in Russia's Arctic territory. So to sum up my conclusion, Arctic politics have been relatively peaceful, cooperative, and that has been a key policy high on the policy agenda of all the Arctic states to build also regional institutions. That institutional order is put under pressure by the more conflictual relationship between the West and Russia, and there are challenges to it, the two I mentioned here, but my guess is that we will see that the cooperative order, driven by economic interests in maintaining stability, will continue. Thank you very much. I hope you have a lot of questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristian. That's been a really good presentation with a somewhat bleak outlook though. I'm really worried about that nuclear option, but I think there will be some questions coming up later. So thank you again. Thank you very much for the presentation. And David, I would like to ask you again. Thank you very much. And dear fellows, if I may introduce David to you just briefly. He's a global fellow and a former director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Polar Initiative. He's also senior advisor at the Canada Institute, and his areas of expertise include polar issues, so not just Arctic, but also Antarctic issues, include US and Canada relations, energy, border security, and NAFTA. So I think that's a good outlook and a good handing over, just coming from the US and Russia tensions and handing over to somebody who has been following these tensions and discussions closely. So David, the stage is yours, and we're looking forward to your presentation. And if you could unmute yourself, then we can understand you just fine. There we go. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt. It's still muted. There we go.
There we go.
Now
okay.
I can hear you. Fine. Perfect. Wonderful.
All right. Let me start over again. I'm going to give a very general discussion of security in the Arctic, and not just traditional geopolitical security, the way most of it goes. And I'm sort of going to get up on a soapbox a little bit and go off on a little rant, if you will, about the way we look at Arctic and Arctic news. We talk about conflict and race for resources and sort of the fear of the Russians. And the way that gets filtered to us or the general public as opposed to specialists in the Arctic community is really important. Catherine, our helper who was on earlier, was talking about how Arctic is really big in the news, and it is. But for the general public, not really. If you look at the U.S. Congress, you've got your senators from Alaska, which is America's Arctic, and not just one of the 50 states, but it's America's Arctic. They have a very difficult time getting in attention of their colleagues in the Congress on Arctic issues for Alaska, but also for the United States. Most of our research tends to be very specific, and we drill down to look at very, very specific things. I would like to take this opportunity and to encourage you folks who are doing very specific issues to raise it up a little bit to a more general area. Experts do know their stuff in depth, but it's often not connected to what's happening in other areas of research. For example, you have great ice science people, but are those folks really connected to what's happening in food security and economic security and geopolitical security, and what does it matter and why does it matter? And how do you get that to a regular politician, a regular decision maker, the man in the street who's going to vote for money to go to these things, and why is it important? They're all connected, we know that, but we have to make our case to other people. I don't want to imply that it's never done. It is done, but it needs to be done a lot more. The Arctic's gained a lot of attention in the last few years. We see certainly in the news a lot more than we have before. Mostly because of the rapid melting of multi-year ice in the Arctic. And I'm going to go to I'm going to hop around on these slides. Whoops. Here we go. We've seen maps like this or images of this, but if you look where climate change is happening, it's really happening in the far northern latitudes, and that makes a big, big difference. You see how far it goes in Russia, halfway down Greenland, well into Canada and the United States, whereas Antarctica not so much, although we do have things there. I'm going to go back to my splash screen. But specific knowledge has increased exponentially. General knowledge, I would say not. And by that I mean a clear understanding of what's happening in the high north by journalists who report to the general public. And by some businesses that propose ill-advised schemes, and by decision makers and politicians who ultimately make the funding decisions, as I mentioned, and the security decisions. For example, we're well aware of Russians that come and buzz American planes and Canadian planes. But are we aware of the American planes that come pretty close to the Russian planes? That happens, but we don't really know about that. We've kind of not decided to take Russia's side on this, but we're all in this together, and Russia has complaints as well. But the decisions that are made have a big effect on defense spending, on economic development, and on the lives of the people in the Arctic. And I think we forget that people live in the Arctic. There are 4 million people who live there. And I will go to my next slide, which is not, from what at least I can see on my computer here, not great. But if you look, those little green dots are settlements of people. And it's a lot in Russia, a lot in Alaska, certainly a lot in Scandinavia and Norway. And if you look at the red lines, those are networks of roads. You see a lot in Canada, not so much in Alaska, and a lot in Europe. The blue lines are on the edges, so these are transportation routes. But let's look at where the people are. And also the blue is ports. And I wouldn't say that they're deep water ports or important ports, but they are ports that receive ocean maritime traffic. There aren't a lot in Russia, as you'll note. Not a lot. So let me leave that there for a minute and go back to my rant on journalists for a minute. The definition of journalism has changed a lot, particularly in the internet age. And I think many journalists are unprepared and ill-equipped to analyze what's happening in the Arctic. So one trip to the Arctic makes someone an expert, and far too often the resulting focus is on interstate conflict and big security geopolitical issues, and not on the cooperation and the collaboration that happens across the Arctic. thus for a lot of outsiders, the Arctic is viewed as the next site of global conflict. And I think Kristian went through a lot of that. He was very good, and I think he posed the question at the end. I don't think he said there's going to be, but we need to think about it. But, or is it a race for resources or an easy, fast transport route? There may be a kernel of truth to some of these, but they have to be put in a larger context. So those of you who are watching, and our panelists as well, I ask you to continue your good research, but discuss it from time to time in terms that will help reporters and the general public and our politicians understand what's really going on, since particularly reporters are the information bridge to the general public. The knowledge that comes across needs to be appropriate to make international funding decisions, to make domestic funding decisions. And we want to make sure, too, that the Arctic doesn't become a backdrop or a framework for issues for the lower climates. I think a lot of groups in the United States used President Obama's trip to Alaska last year as a backdrop for what they wanted in the United States, and not necessarily what was necessary for Alaska, for the American Arctic, for the people there to do what they need. There were some things that did happen, but not as much. It was used as a tool, and I think we really need to look at the Arctic for what it is, its historical significance, and pay attention to the needs of the polar region. So there's my soapbox. I'm sorry for going on about that, but I think it's really important as we get out there and look at things. The Arctic is in an area, as Kristian mentioned, much more of cooperation and collaboration, and it's reflected in the U.S. Arctic policy too. And I'm just going to read since the United States is chair of the Arctic Council right now, 2015 to 2017, I'm going to race through some U.S. priorities, which are protecting the Arctic environment and conserving its living resources, promoting environmental, sustainable natural resource management and economic development, strengthening institutions for cooperation among the 8 Arctic states, meeting national security needs, which is important, enhancing scientific monitoring and research on local, regional, and global environmental issues, and involving indigenous people of the Arctic in those decisions. Now you'll see where the United States put the traditional national security issues a little bit further down. And my point in this presentation is to say the geopolitical security needs are very important, as they are for all the countries that are in the Arctic, but we also have a lot of other security needs, particularly regarding the people and transportation. And again, if you look at the slide that's up there, you'll see where the people are and where the needs are. You'll also note that although the Northern Sea route, which is sort of the purple line on the right of the screen, there aren't very many ports in Russia. And I think we need to remember too that the Arctic north of Russia has been extremely important to Russian identity, to Russian history for a very, very long time. And since the breakup of the Soviet Union, where are the Russian ports? They're essentially in the north. I'm not going to get into Crimea and Ukraine. We can deal with that with Kristian when we come back to questions. But Murmansk is Russia's big naval port, and it's in the Arctic. And I say, and it's in the Arctic. It's not, it's in the Arctic, and Russia decided to make its big port there because it was in the Arctic, because it wants to take over the Arctic. It was there. It's an ice-free port. Speaking of ice-free, if you look, we need to also know the difference between the North American Arctic and the Eastern Arctic, if you will. Norway doesn't have the ice that Greenland and Canada and Alaska have. Very, very important for the way it was developed and why it was developed. But Kristian did post the slide of the Russian flag at the bottom of the ocean floor at the North Pole. And it did cause grave concern among folks in the West, even though Russians claim it was done for internal political reasons. But it sent a chill up the spine of Western observers, and what are we going to do with this? But I say all the Arctic states, I would say particularly Russia, Norway, the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada. Canada was more verbal than actually action on developing military capacity to protect national interests. And I think that's fair, to develop a security system within your own country for defense. I think what we see Russia doing along its coast developing its ports, because as Kristian mentioned, it's all about the economy. If you want to develop the Northern Sea Route, it could be a tool for Russian economic development, but you need ports to do it. Where are the ports on the map? A lot of them are old Soviet bases that need to be re-upped. And so we see a lot of spending going on in Russia, but from what's your 0 point from your comparison? Is it going forward, or is it kind of to pull things up to where they might once have been in order to have a port for the transport, to protect people, to protect trade? Russia, as we know, does not have a lot of spare change running around, particularly after sanctions and with the lower price of oil and gas. So it needs what it can get. And I don't think it's in an offensive position right now. I think it's defensive. I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but that's where I stand on this. Other thing to think about is melting ice. I mean, melting ice means submarines aren't as hidden as they used to be. So another security issue that we need to think about is, with melting ice, who is entering the Arctic, when, and why? It's not just the littoral states that have the naval vessels there, but others are coming as well. The role of NATO is very important, and this was brought up by Kristian as well. Is NATO going to have a role in the Arctic? Canada was very opposed to that, but with recent Russian testing its limits, I think, if you could say, in the Baltic Sea, what it's done with Sweden and Finland are scratching their heads saying, you know, maybe we ought to consider joining NATO, but we also know the way Russia feels about NATO, so we got to think carefully about that. But what kind of chill is this in the Arctic? What is the role of NATO? Can we look at the Arctic security through, if we have to, through a Russian lens? But also look at what are Russia's connections with the West. Is it really in a position to go after, in an offensive position? We talked about the economy and how important it is, but Russia is linked to the WTO, the G20, the Council of Europe, the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, and the Arctic Council. In there, it plays by the rules, has every reason to cooperate in the Arctic. Let me tell a little story about a professor of mine who, and this may have something to do with hers or not, but he said, look, you got the Orthodox churches in the East and the Western non-Orthodox churches, if you will. And what does this have to do with Arctic War thinking? He said in the East that tradition, people, he said, hardwired to grow up to think of holding two opposite ideas in your head at the same time. Whereas we in the West, the Roman Church and others, it's one or the other. So Russia can they can be stinkers on Ukraine and really have good relations with the Arctic on the one hand, but we in the West want one or the other. If Russia's bad on the Arctic, how can it be good? I mean, bad in the Ukraine, how can it be good in the Arctic? So I just think it's an interesting way of thinking that. And if you look at some other Eastern countries, they can hold two ideas in their head, different ideas, and we have a harder time in the West. Or certainly, let me just say, in the United States, we do. But as an international issue, or as the United States, in spite of being chair of the Arctic Council right now, does not look at itself as an Arctic country. I mentioned the legislators who go on the Hill have a very hard time convincing their colleagues that the United States is an Arctic country. And it's not, even though the United States is on the Arctic Council, we do not have the thinking going on, even with the informed public, on the needs of the Arctic and what the United States needs to do from any kind of security base. Looking also at this map, you'll see that Canada is very, very sparsely inhabited. If I had another slide of the two line, actually I'll go to the next one and look at where people live. There we go. Let's hope it stays there. So Russia has almost 2 million people in the Arctic. Canada has about 130,000. Alaska, which is almost the whole population of the state. And which ones have the most, percentage-wise, of native people, you look at Greenland, then Alaska, Norway, not so much Russia or Finland or Sweden. But I want to go back to Canada. Canada is very sparsely populated. Kristian did mention the hostility, I would go as far as to say, that former Prime Minister Harper had towards Russia regarding the Ukraine situation, and part of it was political. There were a lot of Ukrainian Canadians. He did find a base there. But the fact that he sort of muzzled Canadian diplomats because of this, or was not in the room as discussions were going in a lot of meetings, that was a problem. So, and then Greenland, Norway has moved its headquarters halfway up its long, long coast. Makes sense to have it there, but is that seen as a way of, is it Arctic? Maybe bringing its military closer to the Arctic, closer where problems might be, or is it sort of belligerence on the part of Norway? I think not. But we also need to think of other issues, other security issues in the Arctic, especially with regard to non-state actors. Drug smuggling happens and could happen more. There's a lot of abandoned military posts throughout the Arctic that little planes can fly in and out of, and they can be up to no good. We need to think about that. We also need to think about joint policing. United States and Canada do that in various issues through shipwrighter programs and integrated border enforcement teams. But could the U.S. and Russia do a little bit more for the Bering Strait? Could Russia and Norway do more for the sea there? What else? Illegal immigration. We've seen pictures of Syrian refugees coming across from northern Russia into Norway on bicycle. How is that controlled? Climate change is going to increase more refugees, and they're going to want to go to a more temperate place, and that's, as the Arctic is warming, it's still a lot cooler than it is in warmer areas. People jumping off ship. If Arctic shipping is going to increase, you can have people, and they have come into, for example, to Hudson's Bay, into Manitoba, jump ship, and they go off to other parts of Canada. Trafficking in weapons, trafficking in weapons of mass destruction, air terrorism. I did read that flights that remain north of 60 degrees are not subject to security screening, but as more people go and there's more activity there, what does this mean? Is this something we should change? Another issue is protests against energy infrastructure. Greenpeace had some actions off Russia and Greenland that made a lot of notice, and would this get in the way of economic development that happens down the road? So I have more notes than I can talk about, but I want to bring up some other issues, and I can't get into them a lot. Maybe we can bring it up in the question. But environmental security is really important, particularly with melting permafrost, and how indigenous people can continue their hunting and their way of life, or their herding, and what does that do for the folks who live in those areas with regard to permafrost. Economic security and development. How do we increase this? What do the folks there want and need? What's possible with regarding maritime transportation, with ports and routes, and for fishery? What's sustainable? What is sustainable in an Arctic context and not necessarily in a non-Arctic context? Canada, Native peoples in Canada used seals as a tool of economic development, and when the European community cut off seal product, those communities went into a tailspin and they haven't recovered. So imposing other values has its effect. Tourism, mining, scientific cooperation, roads, railroads, icebreaking, navigation, electric grid, all this is necessary if we're going to think of economic, dealing with the environment, dealing with the human security that was brought up a couple weeks ago by Stefan Schott in energy and food. And what is the role of government there? We have very, very different governments. What's the role of the Russian government with relation to its people, which is very different from what Norway is, or Denmark's relationship to Greenland, or Canada's relationship with its very sparse population in the north? And to reiterate what Kristian said a little bit earlier, we do have a lot of cooperative agreements on search and rescue. There was an agreement last year in the Central Arctic Fishery. It's less about competition and more about cooperation, but we have to be aware of the geopolitical issues that could threaten things down the road, although I don't think they will. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. I think that gives us a lot of